Hello and welcome. You're watching Business Plus. I am Shweta Kothari. India's GDP numbers are out. India's Q4 financial year 23 GDP growth has come in at 6.1%, blowing past most estimates. GDP growth for financial year 23 overall has come at 7.2%, higher than the advance estimate, albeit less than 9.1% clocked in financial year 22. The sector-wise growth rate in Q4, let me briefly touch upon it. Agriculture sector grew at 10.3%, mining recorded a growth of 16.3%, construction at 10.4%. Joining me at this point in time to decode these numbers are Professor Arun Kumar. Also joining us very shortly will be Karan Bhasin, who's an economist. Also on the show, Subhash Chandra Garg, who's a former finance secretary. With me in the studio is my colleague Rakesh Khar. Let me come to you, Rakesh, first. Interesting numbers coming in there, especially the overall growth that India clocked in the financial year, higher than even the government estimates of 7%.
Yeah, you know, IMF said India is a bright spot, Shweta, and now we're telling IMF we are brighter than what you thought of us.
Okay.
So in that sense, pleasant surprise, good numbers. A couple of key points is that, you know, the 7.2%, RBI governor at the CII session had said that we would do better than 7. We would do, you know, 6.5% was the earlier estimate. We'll do about 7%. Now he has even bettered his own estimate. So in that sense, it's 7.2%. And quarter on quarter also from 4.4 to 6.1%. Healthy growth. And the macroeconomic numbers are also looking good. The fiscal deficit target has been met, which is again has huge relevance on the entire health of the economy. And I think there are the country is in the investment mode, that is reflected in the GDP numbers. But you know, the consumption mode is still a problem. And the problem which is looking like, we're just looking at the numbers, is private investment, which, you know, I mean, it's been the most talked about thing. I've been talking about it, you know, repeatedly, but it seems the private sector is not listening and it's showing up. And going forward, you know, these numbers to sustain in the election year in FY24 is obviously going to be a challenge, more so from the perspective of agriculture, which has been a big ticket driver this time. Will we be able to sustain the levels because of this El Nino kind of a challenge? That is something that all of us will have to watch. But putting these numbers again in global perspective, Germany is in recession. You know, US is just about
mitigating the debt crisis.
And also possibly going there, hopefully not. And we have China's number. China data has also come today.
Okay.
China data for the first quarter in the calendar is 4.5%.
Okay.
So if there is criticism that Indian data is not all that transparent, so even if you do, China obviously is not the best of the clean data that we have. So peer to peer, we've really done well in that sense.
Okay, peer to peer, we've done well. Subhash Chandra Garg, do you agree with that?
See, I saw the number with a lot of relief. I felt good that the yearly growth has come more than 7%, 7.2% to be precise. Quarterly growth, which was most worrying for me, came higher than 6%. So one did feel good, felt relieved. But I don't think we should be sort of rejoicing only on a quarterly story. We should look at these numbers in a larger detail. I'll just give you one set of information. If you compare with 2018-19, which is the year before the current government came into power for last 4 years, and look at the sectoral composition of the growth in terms of GVA, gross value added, we have a growth of about 3.7% per annum. That is not the growth which India should be satisfied about, should be happy about. 3.7%, it neutralizes, of course, the COVID year when we had the negative growth. If you look at the GDP numbers for last 4 years and work out the CAGR, the growth of GDP is 3.4% only. So 4 years we have grown at only 3.4%. If you look at sectoral composition, in mining sector, we are still not at the level of 2018-19. Our growth is negative in constant currency terms. There is no sector other than agriculture and finance which has recorded growth of over 5%. Most sectors have recorded growth of 3.5%, 4%. Manufacturing, which is most important from the perspective of global trade and all, is still less than 3%. So on the whole, I feel happy at the turnout of the quarter. But if you look at the longer term story, I think it's still time to sort of feel a little sanguine about it and try to work out what is the way in which we can improve our economy on a higher growth path. Thank you.
Okay. Just drawing from what Mr. Garg said here, and that is the sectoral growth are still not there just as yet. Quoted mining as a sector. And so my understanding therefore is, even though we've beat estimates, sectoral growth remains a cause of concern.
I mean, it's ideal that we have a even growth across sectors, but historically, if you look at data, it's not always possible that you have a uniform growth across sectors. That's when we will be doing about 8%. So, what we have at 7%, 7.2% for the entire cumulative financial year is with exceptional growth in some sectors, 10% like we mentioned, and and less than expected growth in many sectors.
Okay.
Manufacturing is one laggard, as I said. Manufacturing is again linked to private investment. Private investment I identified as again a laggard, despite the nudge and despite corporate tax cuts. Where is that tax money, the tax cut money gone? Is it, is it shoring up the profitability of those companies, or, has it come back to capex so that, it is linked back to manufacturing? In that sense, there are challenges. I completely agree with, Mr. Garg when he says that we have to be realistic about what these numbers tell. But, the contrarian point of view, especially from the government's perspective, would be that what if these numbers were less than what was expected? So we have bettered, IMF forecast, and forecasts are also subject to revision. So we do believe that going forward, if we are saying we will target 6.5% for FY24, there may be certain revisions. But a pointed question to our esteemed guest, Mr. Garg, who has seen it all, he's been there inside. We are people from outside and a limited understanding in that sense. What would you prescribe, sir, in terms of exactly 3 key steps so that we sustain this growth momentum in the immediate context? I'm not taking you back to 2018-19 because that's history now. It has relevance, but looking back too much into history, has also a possibility of giving a crash land. So that's the limited, purpose of a rear view mirror. It's important to look at it, but going forward, what would you, identify as 3 key messages that we should look up from this data and, create a policy framework so that we not only sustain this, we move forward?
So, see, this data actually captures the state of the economy as it exists today. It doesn't really show you much about how the future can be captured better, how can we win over the future better. But let me answer in the context of your the data which has come out. I think number one, the manufacturing side is very largely related to the reforms of the public sector. Our manufacturing is quite inefficient. Look at many sectors, we are not able to get across investment. Even the PLIs, etc., are limping along, not making much. So that would require real reforms. That agenda has been virtually stopped. The public sector privatization, massive competitiveness brought about in the private sector. That is one area which is, to my mind, very much important. Second is, how do we handle the energy sector? Because utilities are very important in that sense. And there is mess in the power sector, in the energy sector, whether you look at the oil, gas sector, or you look at the electricity kind of thing. There's been good growth because there is a demand. But despite that, the sector doesn't make contribution very much because the losses in distribution, the problems and the investment which need to come in the renewables and many other sectors which are future is not coming in that. So how do we handle our utility sector? And finally, since you said three points, to my mind, the trade sector which has come now, trade, communications and the hospitality sector, which was until last year a negative growth CAGR over 3 years, is now positive because this year is actually the recovery of the trade and the communications and the hospitality sector. But we need to carry on reforms there, the digitalization, the computerization. We shouldn't be satisfied with only payments, etc. Our semiconductors, our investment into the digital sports, gaming, so many of pieces are there which are future growth sort of conveyors. They need to be attended. So I would put my money at this moment on these three reforms.
All right. Also joining us on the broadcast at this point is Professor Arun Kumar. Sir, appreciate you taking time out. I want to begin by asking your first assessment of the numbers that are coming in. The financial year 23 growth pegged at 7.2%, higher than most advanced estimates. Quarterly growth for the last quarter of financial year of fiscal year 23 at 6.1%. And as far as, fiscal deficit is concerned, that is also looking well, government meeting its targets there.
So, it's a welcome thing that the rate of growth is better than expected. But that's always the case, that expectations are not fulfilled. Things change. Earlier it was expected that there'd be a global recession, which would slow down the economy much more. It was expected that there may be bottlenecks that would continue. So I think on those scores, it's much better. The expected recession has not really materialized at the level that it was expected. Germany's entered recession. Eurozone is slowed down. Britain has just about avoided recession. The US economy is slowing down, but not in recession. But I think as going forward, this debt crisis in the US, that is a cause for worry. So anyway, a lot of things have happened, in the last, 6 months that can change the picture. And that's why you see projecting is always going to be a problem. When we project in the future, we can go wrong. However, what I'd say is that the data is basically the organized sector data. The quarterly data does not incorporate the unorganized sector data except agriculture. Agriculture is measured by assuming that the targets have been fulfilled. Now, at times targets are fulfilled, at times they are not. Earlier, it was expected that agriculture would face problem because there was rainfall. Unlike last year where there was heat, this time there was excess rainfall. It was expected that maybe agriculture crop may decline, but agriculture crop seems to have done well. And that's because the damage was not as much. So there are many factors, internal and external, because of which, the problems have changed. And that's why. But if you include the unorganized sector, which has been declining, the rate of growth is nowhere close to 6 or 7%. It would be closer to 1 or 2%. The unorganized sector is unambiguously declining as far as data suggests. Whether you look at textile sector, you look at leather goods sector, you look at, say, luggage sector, FMCG sector, even the trade sector, where the growth of the e-commerce has been very good. But that's at the expense of the neighborhood stores and the unorganized sector in the trade sector. So we should be happy that the organized sector is growing well, but that causes worry because the unorganized sector has 94% of the employment. And if that declines, then the unemployment rate would rise and the purchasing power at the lower levels would decline. And I think partly why the manufacturing sector growth is not picking up is because the demand at the lower levels is down. Say for in the automobile sector, we see that the four-wheeler higher end vehicle sales go up, but the lower end vehicle sales, those are not picking up, or the two-wheeler sales have not picked up at the level at which they need to pick up. So these are all indications that there is stress there. Now, regarding the fiscal deficit, we can control the fiscal deficit by two things. We can have more revenue or we can cut expenditures. And what has been happening is that we've been cutting expenditures which are for labor-intensive areas. We have increased expenditures in the budget on capital-intensive areas like, say, railways or like highways and things like that, which are now highly mechanized. But rural employment guarantee scheme and things like that, which are labor intensive, those have been curtailed. There the allocations have been less than earlier. And reports suggest that in the rural employment guarantee scheme, people are not getting more than 47 to 50 days per year, whereas they're expected to get 100 days of work. So, that is a cause for worry, because what we need to do is increase employment generation, because unemployment figures are large, our labor force participation rate is low, and that is what really creates the problem at the lower level, why demand in the unorganized sector and demand for manufacturing sector doesn't grow, and therefore there's a problem that comes in from there. So I think while it's welcome to have a good growth for the organized sector, but if that is coming at the expense of the unorganized sector, then that's going to cause problem for the future. And projecting is going to be troublesome, because if the US debt cap, that problem continues, because today the report was that whereas the president and the Republican leader, they have agreed, but in the House itself, the conservatives don't like it. Some of the Democrats also don't like it. So if the cap is not agreed to, then there would be problems there as well. So projecting further would be a problem if these kind of things happen.
Professor Kumar, thank you for being with us on the show. A couple of queries just for my education. It's not that I'm contesting. I completely agree with you that we need to bring in the informal sector, completely on board. But a couple of data points. I just needed your perspective, and also the other gentleman on the panel, his views on that. So one point is that the digitization that has happened has, so to say, formalized the economy to a great extent. And a $3 trillion economy, 1 trillion, one third of that is transactions carried on the digital payment system. So that is happening from small, or the informal economy. Number one. Number two, sir, would you admit that on the curtailment side, actually the government investments and spending have been on the rise, and also it has been matched by heavy tax buoyancy. So would you like to consider these two as pluses, or you think that essentially fiscal deficit management has happened on account of cutting down expenses heavily, which doesn't look like to be the case, because government has been raising its capex level, spending heavily on infrastructure projects?
So it's the total government expenditure increase that matters, not just capex. And the total government expenditure increase this year was less than what the inflation adjusted figure should have been. So in that sense, the total figure was not giving a boost. Now, regarding the capex increase, if you are cutting back on labor intensive areas and doing this, then that causes a problem as far as demand is concerned. Second point is that you see, even if 7.5 lakh crore targeted for this year, if you look at it as a percentage of the total capital expenditure, that's very small. So we are talking about a very small percentage that is going up. What we need is a private sector investment to go up, and the private sector investment has not really been going up, and that's why I haven't seen the data that has come now, what's happening to capital items expenditure in the GDP data. If that is going up, that's a positive sign. But if I remember the capacity utilization data that the RBI gave, and capital investment by the private sector depends on capacity utilization. Unless the capacity utilization goes up to 75-80%, we won't see the private sector investing more. So while some sectors will be crowded in, like for instance steel and cement and so on may be crowded in, but other sectors there may be an issue. And that's where I think we need to look at the disaggregated data, which is not yet available at this point of time. Regarding the tax collection, that proves my point. Taxes are largely collected from the organized sector. So GST is collected largely from the organized sector, because the unorganized sector doesn't come into the picture. So the larger the increase of GST collection, that reflects growth of organized sector, that reflects inflation, that reflects imports. And the GST figures that we usually get are the gross figures, they're not the net figures. So we really don't know what is the net increase in the GST collection unless the data is given. And that data, unfortunately, the government doesn't put out what the net figures are. Secondly, the direct tax increases also have a problem, because corporate tax collection and income tax collection are also largely from the well-off segments in the organized sector. So as the Prime Minister said, only 1.5 crore Indian individuals are effective taxpayers of income tax, and that's entirely from the organized sector. The corporate sector is also the organized sector. So when the tax buoyancy is being shown in the budget, that shows the buoyancy of the organized sector, that doesn't show the buoyancy of the unorganized sector. So unorganized sector, we only have data points like in the FMCG sector, Hindustan Unilever saying in its annual report that our market share is going up. In the leather goods industry, the organized sector saying our market share is going up. In the luggage industry, all these data points are available for many sectors that the market share of the organized sector is going up, that only at the expense of the unorganized sector. So therefore, that causes problem that the GDP data does not reflect the full GDP increase in the economy. But yes, for the organized sector, it's good.
Mr. Garg, how do you read the fiscal data numbers? Are you largely in sync with what Professor Kumar is saying, or there's actually a healthy growth in taxation? As he's pointed out, he's agreed on that point. And the other one is the big question that everyone has to answer, is that what will it take for the private sector to actually step in and do its bit? Having got the corporate tax concessions, and there's a huge nudge from the government at all levels, right at the level of the Prime Minister. Why is it that the GDP data that we have, early numbers, shows that probably the level of expectation on private sector investment isn't keeping with the forecast. What would it take to actually get the private sector igniting the economic engine again? Mr. Garg?
Audible to you?
Yes, sir, you are.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that was addressed to you, sir.
So on the fiscal numbers, see, I don't know, we somehow get used to a very bad situation as a normal situation. Fiscal deficit of 6.4% or 6.5% is a very high level of fiscal deficit for the country. Last budget, if you remember, the government actually increased the fiscal deficit number, anticipating, despite higher nominal GDP, which was expected, the fiscal deficit in quantity as well as in percentage was increased. Now, if you have met 6.5% of GDP as fiscal deficit, I don't think this is a great thing to do. We have to bring the fiscal deficit down to more normal levels of 3.5% or so. That's on the fiscal. The tax growth has been good last 2 years. Last year was slightly lower than the previous year growth, but still very decent growth, largely on account of two factors, which I've been saying all along: inflation as well as the imports. Both these macroeconomic factors are going down. So you don't expect this year's tax growth to be very buoyant. In 23-24, if we have tax growth of about 10 or 11%, I think we would be quite lucky and happy about. To come to your question about this private sector investment, you see, it's not a very complex thing. Private sector is not in charitable business. This is in the business of making money, and it does its service by providing the products and services to people which they need for consumption, for meeting their demand. So the fact that the private sector is not investing, number one, on the traditional industries, textile, steel, and others, is that there is overcapacity. We would have been in very deep problem in the steel, cement sector also, if the government had not been spending very heavily on the construction of railways and the roads, where most of the capex is going to. If that demand was not there, even these sectors would have been in problems. The future goods and services demand, digital side, environmental side, and the services, which is the real thing, doesn't require very heavy investment itself, and that is where the investment is taking place and that is what explains why our services are doing well in terms of global exports and all. You don't require, but wherever you require, for example, even in renewables and digital sector, you see the problems which the today's news item suggested, that even the semiconductor piece, the three people who showed interest, one was not considered, two remained in race, even one which was in the race is not likely to get. Despite this policy being there on semiconductor investment for quite some time, we have not seen investment because we have a policy related problems. Renewables, we still are trying to encourage the domestic manufacturing of cells and the modules and all, but by imposing heavier duties for import and all. But we don't have technology, we don't have competitive investment, which raises the cost of producing power. As a result, neither we are getting investment in renewables by using the imported cells, modules and technology, or the domestic not being available. So I think we need to get our policy right for the new investment, and for the existing, the demand has to sort of pick up for investment or private sector to get excited about making investment. No homilies, no exhortations, no Hanumans are sleeping, those kind of remarks, etc. are going to get it. They are hard-nosed people. They must make investment only when they see the right kind of opportunity.
Interesting. I mean, there could be a counter view that, it's all about risk taking and building capacity, especially when there's been a corporate tax concession given. So in that sense, yes, there has to be a perfect business case. On the other point that Professor Arun Kumar raised, Mr. Garg, on formalizing or the inability of the GDP to pick the unorganized economy activity. I mean, have we moved somewhat forward on that with digitization, or we're still, not able to pick up the key trends? I gave the UPI transactions data, I mean, even the street vendor, everyone is carrying out two of them, and they have a Paytm, they have a, parallel instrument in case one of them fails. So in that sense, are we truly living in two worlds where there's one formal economy which is growing and the other informal economy which is in decay?
There is no doubt.
Mr. Garg.
It has reached even the small sector, very low income people. UPI data tells you very clearly that the payments are expanding massively in all sectors. That is true. But let us remember, payments is not value addition. There is a difference between value addition, which gets into the GDP and the GVA, and the payments which are made for completing the transactions. Whether you make a cash payment or whether you make a UPI payment, it doesn't make difference as far as the GDP is concerned. So if you want to look at the GDP and GVA increases, then the real elements and the factors which we were discussing earlier need to be sort of counted. I have a slightly different understanding than Mr. Arun Kumar about the capturing of the informal sector's data. In fact, my sense is that since the GDP numbers are calculated based on the formal sector growth and the informal sector data is not available, so there is a little bias of over projecting the growth at this stage of these provisional numbers and all, which gets corrected. We collect real data for only the corporates, and our annual survey also is very limited to about 3 odd lakh crores of factories and all, and the small sector gets indirectly computed. So that sector is increasingly becoming being brought into the formal and digital space by sort of loans being extended through the fintechs and others, but still a very, very small portion, maybe 5 to 10% of that sector has been sort of reached really in the sense of digitalization inclusion than the entire one. We have a long way to go still.
Okay. On the unorganized sector, and this is a question for Professor Kumar. Professor Kumar, we talked about agriculture sector, and from the numbers that we have at this point in time, agri sector grew at 5.5% as opposed to 4.7% in the previous quarter. If agri sector is any indication of how unorganized sector is performing, numbers are looking good.
So, there are two components of the unorganized sector. The agriculture sector is also unorganized largely, and then the non-agriculture unorganized sector is there. Now, I have looked at the way the data is collected, and of the 39 sub-sectors of the unorganized sector, 29 are measured by the growth in the organized sector. And therefore, what we are doing is you are massively overestimating the growth of the unorganized sector and non-agriculture. So agriculture doing well doesn't mean that the entire unorganized sector is also following the same pattern. What you need to do is you need to look at what's happening and what the reports are coming from the organized sector and the unorganized sector. Say, for instance, Tirupur, in Tamil Nadu and so on, they're suggesting that 20 to 30% of the units have closed down there. Similarly, when Hindustan Unilever says that our market share is growing because the small scale sector is not able to cope, or when Parle-G biscuits are selling much more because the local biscuits are not selling. Similarly, in the shoe industry, in the leather goods industry, in the textile industry, etc., you're getting these reports that the organized sector is growing at the expense of the unorganized sector. And the biggest example is that e-commerce is growing dramatically in India for the last 5-6 years, and that is at the expense of the neighborhood stores. So the neighborhood stores represent the unorganized sector. And you see, having more UPI, as Mr. Garg rightly pointed out, doesn't mean that the unorganized sector is doing well. It's simply that the payment is being made through that, but that doesn't mean that they are performing better.
But they're not
Also,
sitting idle. They're not sitting idle either, sir. There is a transaction involved. It has a business connotation.
But the point is, it doesn't represent their production. They may be, instead of using cash transaction, using UPI transaction, but the business is less than what it was earlier.
Yeah,
so when
agreed. It's less, but it exists.
So market share going down is the important thing. You see, that's what shows that their rate of growth is zero or negative. So if you take the 31%, that's the unorganized sector in non-agriculture, and they're declining, then of course, your rate of growth is much lower than 6% or 7%.
Absolutely. I mean, in an ideal environment, the MSMEs which he's talking about, they all need to fire up as much as they should have, and they've been hit by a chain of events from demonetization to GST, so they're recovering from that end. But overall, imagine if these numbers even in agriculture were down, as has been historically been the case. So in that sense, we're blessed with a great monsoon, which is resulting in agriculture showing up. And FMCG profitability numbers are also looking good.
Right.
So there is a correlation somewhere. Obviously, we're not filling and ticking all the right boxes as of now. Okay. But the overall trajectory, we have noticed globally the entire environment, the Europe is in deep stress. Our neighborhood is I call it the fiscal ICU. So, in that sense, India's story has a lot of positives to take away.
One of the sectors where we are struggling at this point in time, and that is manufacturing, with GVA up merely 1.3%, higher than the government estimate of 0.6%, but very modest. Very modest.
I think what Mr. Garg rightly mentioned. He's been in the government. I don't know, if I can be brutally frank and say that, why is it at the highest level we've still not been able to bring about these key domestic reforms? I mean, the big ticket reforms that we talk about, land reform, labor reform, obviously there are key political challenges in that. Though it's sad that with such heavy mandate we've not been able to pull them through for whatever reasons. But the other reforms that he mentioned, about processes where efficiencies would come up, I think that's an area which needs to be addressed immediately so that there is a leg up to it. And it's linked again to private sector investment, because manufacturing, either the public sector is essentially a laggard, let's face it, with few exceptions, the Navaratnas or the Mahanavaratnas. Rest of it is obviously a challenge.
Okay. Arun wants to come in here. Professor Arun?
So, there are 6,000 large units, there are 6 lakh small and medium units, and 6 crore micro units. It's the micro units and the small units that are losing market share that are declining. And because of them, the demand comes down because they employ 94% of the workforce, which is the unorganized sector. So if demand there comes down, then the manufacturing sector doesn't have increasing demand, and therefore it begins to slow down. And that then has its implications. So as Mr. Garg rightly pointed out, if you have spare capacity in some of these mass consumption items like textiles and leather goods, etc., then the investment there will be less. So even though the government is investing more, say in railways and roadways, which is pulling demand for steel and cement, etc., up, okay, it doesn't mean that it's pulling the demand for the other mass consumption items. That is where we need to focus. And the micro sector, 6 crore units, they are in deep trouble, as the data seems to suggest that there the decline is enormous. I've been going to some of the JJ clusters around Delhi, etc., and I've been finding that every household is suggesting that they're not getting employment. And our labor force participation rate is one of the lowest in the world. We have 46% labor force participation rate, whereas Brazil and China has 65, 66%. Some countries have 70%. So we have 20% less people in the labor force who are maybe working, but not for an income. And therefore the demand becomes low. And when the demand becomes low, we have problems. And as I was saying, that the unorganized sector, of the 39 sub-sectors of the unorganized sector, 29 are measured by the organized sector. So the organized sector is being used as a proxy for the unorganized sector in our GDP collection data. And that doesn't change in the annual data also. Quarterly data, definitely it's not there. In fact, the full organized sector is also not there in the quarterly data. In the quarterly data, there are 300-400 companies whose corporate sector results come. That data is used. So not even the full organized sector data is used in the organized sector.
Okay. Karan Bhasin, economist, is joining us at this point in time. Karan, appreciate you taking time out. What are you making of these numbers coming up? We've been discussing some of the core sectors, organized, unorganized. As far as unorganized is concerned, a little bit of debate there on whether India is progressing, doing as good as it is doing in case of an unorganized sector.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into the organized versus unorganized sector debate at this point because I've been getting into this debate with Professor Arun Kumar for quite some time now, and I think it's a dead end because there's no point getting into that. As far as the numbers are concerned, I think the numbers are quite encouraging given the fact that we are into a very sharp monetary tightening regime. And that's an important point to consider because, you know, we just went from real negative rates to real positive rates. And if at that transition, you know, we still have 6.2% growth rate in the final quarter, which beats all estimates, especially from professional forecasters, then that suggests that the domestic growth process is quite robust and quite, you know, contrary to what we would have expected given all the global headwinds that, you know, have transpired over the last couple of months, including stress in financial sector in certain parts of the world. So all in all, I think the numbers are quite encouraging. I do suspect that these numbers would be revised downwards subsequently as more data becomes available. But nonetheless, I think at this moment, you know, it's an encouraging sign for the Indian economy.
Karan, good to see you and good to have you back on the show with a beard, which is an add-on. Tell me, you know, I also, you know, we have heard Professor Arun Kumar and he's obviously brings a lot of scholarship and this unorganized and organized. I think it's not either or from my perspective. We need to fire both the engines, and big ticket growth is obviously going to come from large investments and large corporations who generate big ticket employment, especially in the manufacturing sector. And there is a cyclical effect. Coming back to the forecast, you know, economists love to forecast. They're hated for that as well because they keep revising downwards, upwards. So in that sense, how do you look at these numbers in the election year? You know, I mean, is it when we close 24 or are approaching elections, say in December, you know, from the political economy perspective, are these numbers good enough? Is there a story there about, you know, jobless growth or, you know, inflation? How do you see panning? I'm trying to simplify GDP data for a common man and trying to mainstream it, if I can use that phrase, Karan, and how do you read it in that sense?
Well, I mean, you know, at the aggregate level, of course, we have recovered from the pandemic shock, which is, of course, you know, something that was the first stage towards getting back on track. You know, so I think that's, again, something that, you know, we should keep in mind. But, you know, strictly from an economic standpoint, we should expect slower growth during the current financial year. everyone is expecting a slower growth. I think the government also has revised down its expectations for the coming or the ongoing financial year. And basically what that means is that you would be expecting, slightly smaller nominal growth in your incomes, which would, of course, have an impact on people from a political economy standpoint. The good thing there, though, is that because inflationary pressures are kind of, easing, I think somewhere that might mitigate it to some point. But, nonetheless, we went very sharp economic shock, and the effects of it are just gradually withering away. So there will be a lot of effect on the elections, and you would see some of it play out, later this year in December as well. So you're correct in that assessment.
Mr. Garg, in terms of the narrative on the economic growth, how does it pan out from your perspective? I mean, one way of looking at it is that India is doing relatively much better than the rest of the world. As I said, our neighborhood is in deep trouble, Europe is in trouble, and going forward, India also will have to revise the growth levels that we have Karan mentioned. But is it good enough, or there would be, in the political narrative, a key challenge in saying and convincing the electorate that we truly have a formidable story in the economic growth perspective?
So if you look at the GVA numbers a little more closely, you would find that the trade, hospitality and the communication sector recorded the highest growth of 14% during this year. And the next high growth was in construction, which is about 10%. These two sectors make up more than 1/3 of the total gross value added. And if they have grown at such hefty rates, the contribution to the GVA growth of 7% by these two sectors is more than half. That is what makes when you generalize the impact on the population, on the people, and also in comparison to the other countries. The construction sector is largely, the growth is because of the heavy government capital investment in railways and roads, as well as also in a little bit in the housing sector. So these sector is driving. If you continue to do that kind of expenditure in these sectors, perhaps this will continue to grow, but the rest of the sectors are not seeing any extraordinary growth, which to me makes us sit and think about how to turn those sectors around. This global comparison business I find a little nauseating, in fact, if I can put it this way. There is no comparison between India and the US and the EU and all. They are the high income countries, $50,000, $60,000. We are struggling at $2,000, $2,400 per capita income. They don't have to grow. Their population stopped growing. They are actually not needing much of the growth. Whereas we, who are living in real poverty and poor quality of life in that sense, need to grow. So we should compare with the Vietnams and Indonesias and some of the other developing countries which are growing, rather than comparing and being satisfied about the EU or the US growth. Chinese growth rate also sometimes is presented in a very wrongful way. China did not have a negative growth in the COVID year of 2020. That was the one country which never had a negative growth. We sunk 6% in 1 year, and we had to make up. So that make-up growth should not be considered as something which is very high growth. So, and then you see the 9% which came up year before is down to 7% or so. If we are losing momentum in times to come, and as everyone projects that next year the growth might be 6% or a little around that, less or more, then perhaps we are again getting onto the trajectory which indicates that after normalization, our normal growth, long-term normal growth, if it is 5 or 6% or lower, then I'm worried. I don't think that's a great thing to be. We have to grow at 8-9% or so to bring our population, our country to a reasonable level of life. We shouldn't be satisfied and happy about that we are growing better than EU countries or US.
All right.
Karan is there or is left?
Hey, Karan is there.
Karan, interesting,
I wanted to come in here because, any serious person who studies growth would dare never say that growth process is independent of advanced economies, because those are the countries with real, purchasing power that drives a lot of discretionary spending, which flows through in emerging market economies. So anyone who says that we don't need to look at growth in the US, EU, or that we have decoupled or emerging markets have decoupled, I wouldn't take that, to be a very good assessment to begin with. And as far as the question about, growing at 8% is concerned, I think, a lot of these things make a lot of sense when you say it in media, but when you sit down to work with actual data, with, empirical stuff, whether that's Clem's data or whatever, you realize that 8% was never a stable growth rate for India to begin with. And India's high growth years coincided with high global growth years, even during the 2006 to 2009 phase, and that sort of growth is no longer happening in the global economy. So the next question is that if the global economy is going to grow at 2 percentage points less, if China is going to grow at half the rate that it grew in the first decade of this century, then where will that additional external growth come for to be able to grow at, say, 7.5 rates above 7.5%? So I think serious commentators should be a bit careful before they kind of make these kind of comments, because they lead a lot of confusion. They create an aspiration which is very difficult to meet, and they also lead to a lot of policy errors in due course, which lead to unsustainable growth. So I think we have to be a bit careful there. And also on China, there's a lot of evidence emerging that a lot of the statistics that they've pushed over the last 2 decades have been actually overestimating growth process per se. So I wouldn't take the numbers that come out of China at the moment very seriously, and I don't think anyone else should either, till there's greater transparency in the way they compute their national accounts.
Interesting, Karan. I mean, I think the best part is that the India economic growth story merits a debate at the most transparent level, and that's what distinguishes us from China. Because even on China, the first quarter calendar data is 4.5%, so we have bettered them on that count. Personally, I think my bet is on we are.
I think Mr. Garg wants to come in and respond to
okay,
respond to
respond to. As the healthy tradition of democracy,
Absolutely.
We must bring in Mr. Garg.
I think this, what Karan said, I respect his assessment and his way of thinking. And it is also true that a lot of countries actually had grown when the developed countries like US, etc., had a high demand growth. They grow, as we call the export-oriented growth stories, whether it was Taiwan, Japan or South Korea, and later even China. But please remember, the times are never same. The times when the developed world or the advanced industrialized world was growing at higher growth rates and was increasing in demands are gone. And when that demand goes out, the only way you can actually take advantage of their larger economies, and even today, US economy with 23-24 trillion, the EU economy another 17-18 trillion dollar, is that you can compete out somebody else. Because if there is no increasing demand to supply your goods and services, then you can't. And that is where for the new times, for the change time, you have to look for new strategies. There is an enormous growth in the demand globally, including in advanced countries, about services, but not manufacturing. So either you accept a situation that we are dependent too much on the traditional growth of the advanced countries, and if they don't grow, we will not grow. Or you have one of the two strategies, or both of them, that you grow the domestic economy to grow, which the China is also doing of late. And secondly, you become so competitive that you substitute the others' exports and others to gain share. For example, let me give you one example: electronics sector. After the Chinese manufacturing is being shifted by US and other countries to sort of safeguard themselves from the dependence on one country, we are not able to capture much of that demand. Vietnam today exports 15 times more than the electronics which we do. We have touted and shouted all over about our mobile manufacturing, but if you look at the real value addition, which is the gain from the economic point of view, the real value addition is actually very small if you compare that with competing countries like Vietnam. So I think while we can't depend, but we will have to have the external demand to push our growth, but we can't really be relying only on that, and we can't be relying on the wrong strategies to capture that demand and expecting that if it emerges, then we will do it.
Okay, I think Karan wants to respond, and then we'll have to quickly wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, so two quick points. I think it's good to see Mr. Garg concede that 8% is of course a very challenging and aspirational growth, given the fact that global growth is going to be slowing. So I think we're on the same page there. But as far as his comments about Vietnam, and you see, when supply chains are shifting, of course, Vietnam, Indonesia had a head start because they've been in this game for quite longer, and they're much more efficient in terms of attracting investments, and a lot of that competitiveness actually happened when Mr. Garg was still in the government. So I think he should probably he's better in a position to explain why we didn't do stuff that we should have done at that point. But moving beyond, the point about adding less value at the moment, even with what we are doing, that's typically how industrial policy, operates, because you kind of create capacity at assembling to begin with, and then once you have enough domestic assembling or domestic value addition, even at the lower, value added part of the service being done in an economy, right? That kind of creates scope for further downstream industries to come in. And what we see happening in at least the case of mobile phones, particularly in the case of Apple, is exactly that. First, we went into just simply getting SKDs and assembling, and now there's a lot of downstreaming of the investment activity also happening. So my humble submission here is that let's not hurry into comparing us with Vietnam and Indonesia when we are late to the game. Let's not compare to China, because again, there also we are late to the game by at least a decade. Give it some time, and then you might have a better assessment of which policies have worked and which policies haven't. Premature assessments and course correction without giving a policy full time to show its effect is only going to do more damage to our growth process than any benefit. So we must be conscious and cognizant of this fact.
All right. I think we're going to wind this up, and I want to wind this up with you. The big takeaways, Rakesh, very interesting discussion there on whether we should draw comparisons from global developed economies, because they're slowing down. India is still registering a 7.2% growth. May not be revised downwardly. We'll have to wait and watch out for that. But I think the big takeaway from this entire debate around organized, unorganized sector, comparisons with developing versus developed economies, is that where we are at the moment, we need to give more time for policies to finally show up some result before we can draw comparisons.
I think there are two parts to it. I'm happy that we went beyond the pure play number, GDP number story, and we've been able to look at the India trajectory from a very, very dispassionate perspective, with Mr. Garg being in the government so long, and then Karan having his own scholarship to bring on the table. I think aspiration is fair. I mean, 8% growth aspiration is an aspiration. Let's be clear about that. Nothing wrong to have an aspiration. Okay. But all these years there have been challenges. And second is realism. So I think it will be fair to say, and I think Mr. Garg wouldn't correct me on that, it's fair to assume and say that the trajectory is right. And we live in an interconnected world. Every time we talk about living in an interconnected world, I mean, we see what happened with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I mean, if you want to decouple, when we began with the vaccine, we talked about vaccine nationalism. From vaccine nationalism, where again India scored really big, both from strategic and execution perspective.
Right.
To, how do we deal with the oil, challenge and crisis, which is again dependent on India's import economy. So I think solutions are coming forth. The trajectory is right.
Right.
An honest and dispassionate review is required. Every time we come and discuss, we must be dispassionate. But by and large, looking at the world, because the COVID didn't just hit us, it hit rest of the world. We have to look at how they performed.
Absolutely.
I mean, even if they are the healthiest, but they also got stuck.
Right.
We were not healthy, but still we are emerging.
Right.
I leave it at that, Shweta.
So trajectory is right, but some realism also needed when we read these numbers. Interesting numbers coming in there. GDP growth at 7.2% for financial year 23, better than most estimates. Also, GDP growth for the last quarter of financial year 23 coming in at 6.1%. So good news there for the government, at least for today. And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Business Plus. Thanks very much for watching.